to be very obsequious to you. I yield for a question while retaining the floor.
Well, I thank the senator from New Jersey. Thank you for your kind words. And I would just say the country is so grateful for what you are doing right now, because so many people are so frightened, worried, scared, and angry about what is happening to the basic values of this country that so many people have just thought would be there, that their kids would be able to go to school and get an education and not have to worry that the Department of Education was going to be gone and there wasn't a watchdog anymore or somebody to help them, or that the research at NIH was going to be dismantled. Perhaps they had a family member who was in the middle of some kind of scientific experiment that is now being dismantled. What happens to their hope? I hear from people on so many topics, seniors who are waiting on hold for hours and then getting hung up on because there's nobody to answer the phone anymore. These are basic values that we have as a country, that we care for other human beings and we're there as a country for them. And you are showing that fight today and inspiring so many people. And I will ask you a question in a minute, but I want to personally thank you for what you are doing today. It is so important. You are the voice of so many people today, and I so appreciate it. Now, I want to change the dynamic a little bit. I wanted to come today. You have talked about the impact in so many areas in our country, but I wanted to come and ask you about something really personal to me, and that is the impact on our veterans today. The senator may not know this, but when I came to the Senate many years ago, I asked to be on the Veterans Affairs Committee. I was the first woman ever to ask to be on the Veterans Committee. And the reason for me was very personal. As you may know, my dad was a World War II veteran, and my family relied on his VA care when he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. But I also, when I was in college during the Vietnam War, many of my friends and colleagues were on the streets demonstrating, and my heart was out to them, but I was thinking about those men and women my age who were going over to Vietnam and coming back and injured in many different ways. So I actually did my college internship. I asked to be at the Seattle VA. And I went to the Seattle VA during the Vietnam War and served on what was the psychiatric ward at the time. And I sat and worked with young men and women who were my age, in college age, who'd been sent there and came back with severe mental health impacts. Now, today we call that PTSD, but at the time we didn't know it. And I was looking at these men and women who volunteered to go over, or sometimes their number came up at the time, and came home and were going to be impacted the rest of their lives. And I learned firsthand what it means when somebody says, I will go for my country to fight for all of you, so that you have that America that you've been talking about here for you when you get home. And our promise to each and every one of them was, if you serve your country in the military, we will take care of you when you get home. That is a promise I hold near and dear to my heart, which is why I asked to be on the Veterans Committee when I first came here, first woman ever. And I will tell you, I've seen the impact time and time again. I go home and I hold town halls when I was newly here, and there'd be a lot of veterans who'd come and talk to me and tell me what's going on, what needed to be fixed. But always at that time, I will share with my colleagues, women never said anything. There were a few always in the back of the room, and it wasn't until the regular meeting was over and they'd come up quietly to me and say, I need to tell you what's happening to women veterans. I need to share with you sexual assault. I need to share with you that there's not the facilities. I go to the VA, and it's a men's only kind of place. There's no OBGYNs. There's nobody to do mammographies. And I often don't feel comfortable sitting in that waiting room with a whole lot of people after I have had the experiences that I've had, and there's no place for women to go. So we've worked really hard to make sure the VA works for women. We've worked really hard to make sure the VA addresses the issues of today. The PACT Act that we worked so hard to make sure that men and women who were victims of a toxic exposure overseas got the services they need. I could speak for 2 hours here about all the things we've done. But then I see what this administration is doing to those men and women who we asked as a country to serve overseas or to here at home, in service of all of us and the promises we've made them. And I think, what are they doing? They're undermining the very value that all of us have given to Americans who serve above and beyond. So when I hear of 2,000 layoffs a few weeks ago, I go, wow, where's that coming from? Well, I know, because I'm getting the phone calls, like I'm sure you are, from a VA research who has been taken off the job, fired, unexplained, told he wasn't doing a good enough job somehow, doing research on basic things like prosthetics, or doing basic research on PTSD, or doing basic research on the kinds of things that our men and women who serve overseas are subjected to and need to come home and have the specialized service and resources that they need. Or I hear from veterans who can't get the services that they've been asked for. So now when we are hearing this administration is about to cut 80,000, you didn't hear me wrong, 80,000 more people from the VA, a vast majority themselves are veterans. I wanted to ask the senator, how does that hit you? How do you feel about that?
I'm so grateful you brought this up. And especially all the work we had to do when I got elected 12, 13 years ago. One of the earliest things I did is meet with women and veterans in my state and heard these awful stories about how long it took to get gynecological care, the waits that they had to do, the indignities they had to endure. And I'm glad we've made so many strides, in part thanks to your leadership in New Jersey, with special dedicated facilities to our women veterans, with shortening those wait times, with prioritizing them. But you're now right. Their proposal is to cut 83,000 positions from the VA. And you know this, you said it, this just years ago, this governing body passed the PACT Act with overwhelming bipartisan support. It was signed by President Biden in August of 2022, the largest health care and benefit expansion in VA history. You were one of the leaders, increasing disability compensation and extending eligibility for VA care. To meet this increased demand, the VA added 61,000 employees in 2023. These new hires included claim processors, physicians, nursing staffs, medical support assistants, food service workers, and housekeeping staff. And now the progress this body made is in jeopardy by this president. We added 61,000 just to keep up with the demands and the needs, and now he's cutting 83,000. This is an article, if you don't want me to yield. DAV urges Veteran Affairs to be more transparent about vet care amid layoffs and budget cuts. Veteran Affairs Secretary Doug Collins says veterans' care won't be impacted. We saw the largest expansion of VA healthcare benefits in a generation under the PACT Act. Collins attended DAV's recent midwinter conference where he came from behind the podium, walked into the audience, and told attendees that vet care and benefits would not be impacted by the Trump administration. In recent appearances on CBS Eye on Veterans podcast, DAV Communications Chief and Air Force veteran Dan Clare said the VA has not demonstrated how it's going to keep its promise. They have not demonstrated it. DAV also does not have a lot of information about what's planned, he said. Can you imagine that? Leaving all these veterans with insecurity and uncertainty. Now we're hearing about the 83,000 people losing their jobs. 20,000 or so folks might be veterans themselves. We're concerned about how we're going to be able to cut that many people and maintain care and benefits. The VA hired thousands of staffers since 2022 in response to the PACT Act, which brought 800,000 new enrollees into its systems. Collins has said cutting the VA workforce by 83,000 would bring it back down to its 2019 level before we did all those expansions to help women's vets. Clare said he has not heard about specific performance problems with those who've been laid off. Well, you haven't heard about it. Veterans' needs have not changed, and they remain great. The people who are sick from the burn pits didn't necessarily get better overnight, and some of these folks are going to have a long road to hoe when it comes to their health. DAV is getting calls frequently from veterans who are scared, angry, and don't understand what's going on and how it's going to affect them. Clare was one of the first whistleblowers on burn pits in Iraq, which eventually inspired the fight to pass the PACT Act to help veterans who became sick or even died from their toxic exposures. When we started talking about dioxin, when Vietnam veterans heard that, they immediately thought of Agent Orange. And that's probably what this is, our generation's Agent Orange. There's a lot of decisions being made behind closed doors, he continued. We want to know what the plan is. We want to know what the plan is. We're not against efficiency of government. We're not against even removing VA employees who may not be fit performers. A veteran has a unique understanding of another veteran's needs, Claire continued. When you lose those folks out of the VA, the veterans, you lose an institutional capacity to understand veterans. It is also unclear how these cuts will impact VA research, which Claire also stressed has helped veterans deal with complex issues that are service-connected, such as traumatic brain injuries and post-traumatic stress. In addition to being concerned about how recent budget cuts and staff reductions will impact veterans care and caregivers, Claire said DAV is also concerned about the impact on veteran-owned small businesses. DAV is asking veteran business owners whose contracts have been recently canceled or who have been fired from their VA jobs to reach out here. DAV is actively keeping a list of veterans negatively affected by the Trump administration's cuts and plans on fighting for them in the weeks and months to come. And those lists that they're keeping are getting longer and longer and longer of people affected by this. So to answer your question, it's absurd, it is offensive, it's ready, fire, aim. Tens of thousands of veterans laid off, veterans who do business and work in contracts ended. Why is this another group that the President of the United States is scaring? Frightened veterans, angry veterans. I'm hearing from them in my state. You know you're hearing them from yours. What's the plan? What's the plan? What's the plan? They have no answer for us. All they're doing is cutting Social Security staff, undermining the delivery of those services, they're cutting the VA services. And why, by the way? Is it creating efficiency or effectiveness? No. Is it to create savings? Because we got to create savings to give more of those tax cuts to billionaires like Elon Musk. It is not fair. It is not right. When we send people off into the most dangerous environments on the planet Earth and ask them to put their lives on the lines for us, the least we can do as a nation is not penny pinch on their backs of the service that they deserve.
For one additional question.
I yield for a question while retaining the floor.
The senator's right, and so many veterans are afraid right now. And I had a veteran tell me that he was one of those people that got the letter, you haven't performed well. He worked for the National Park Service, actually. And he said, I've been saving lives. I've been cleaning trails. I've been making sure that the national parks are safe for all of you. And then he said to me, I'm a veteran. I served in the war. And I served my country there because I wanted to serve my country and my fellow Americans. And I came home and worked for the National Park Service to do the same. And now, as a veteran, my country's not there for me. And I would just say to my colleague and to everyone who's listening, to these men and women that we make a promise to, that we say we will be there for you when you come home, that does not mean slamming a door in your face. It doesn't mean that you have to wait for hours to get the services that you earned. It doesn't mean that you will be mistreated. It means that we will honor you. And I would thank the senator for his response and just say to him again, do you think we're treating men and women in this country as great Americans by the actions that are being taken by this administration?
Thank you for the question. No, and I'm just going to read another article that's going to make even clearer the point you just laid that's so strong and so important. This is from Axios, how White House firings are hurting veterans. The Trump administration's big cuts to the federal government are hitting one group particularly hard, the country's veterans. Why it matters? Many of those who've served in the military derive a sense of purpose and belonging from their government work, viewing it as a way to serve their country and help their peers outside of active duty. The big picture. It's not clear yet how many vets have been fired or will be. Last year, veterans made up 28% of the federal workforce, 28%. Per federal data, a far bigger share than the 5% in the private sector. About 36% of the vets working in civil service, more than 200,000 in total, are disabled or have serious health conditions per federal data. 36% of the vets working in civil service are disabled vets. This is the largest attacks on veteran employment in our lifetime, says William Attig, Executive Director of the Union Veterans Council, a large group that represents many of these workers. Attig, who was deployed in Iraq from 2003 to 2009, has been talking to newly unemployed members, trying to get a tally of everyone whose job was lost. Zoom in now. Some veterans still holding on to their jobs for now are waiting for the hammer to drop. We're being smeared as leeches, but I just want to serve my country and provide for my family, an employee at the Department of Defense who's a disabled veteran, and requested anonymity because he didn't want to put his job at risk. Talk about free speech. We're being smeared as leeches, says a disabled veteran who stood for us. And he was thrilled to land his job, he said a few months ago, but is anxiously waiting to see if he'll be one of the more than 5,000 workers at the Pentagon that the Pentagon said it would fire next week. Privately now, GOP lawmakers are growing uneasy with the cuts to veterans. I know this because I know the heart of so many of my Republican colleagues. Politico reports adding that vets have been disproportionately affected by firings, and again, GOP lawmakers are growing uneasy about it. The White House did not say how many veterans have been fired. At least one department, the Department of Interior, has rapidly carved out an exception for them. President Trump has consistently stood up for our brave men and women, delivering crucial reforms that improve VA health care, said White House spokesperson Anna Kelly in an email. There are a few reasons government work attracts vets. The federal government has a veterans preference. Put simply, when deciding among a group of qualified candidates, they're first in line. I think that's right. You'd have to jump through a lot of hoops to not hire a veteran, said a former official. With more veterans working in government, more feel welcome to work among people who understand them. Others are drawn to their retirement benefits. Years of military service counts towards your federal pension. Plus, though, many of these folks feel drawn to mission-driven employment. Most veterans feel like they're putting on another uniform when they go work in other federal agencies. These jobs are a crucial piece of the puzzle in most military life, he says, adding that it's also a key part of suicide prevention for this at-risk group. One of the most important things you can do for a veteran is help them with a job. How can we expect to maintain what is in America an all-volunteer force if we fail to show those folks willing to serve how we care for our service members when they come home? Slashing more than 83,000 jobs from the VA alone, it's clear that these cuts are going to have a disproportionate impact on veterans, veteran contractors, and the services they receive. I'm angry about these cuts, but most of all, it should make all Americans feel a sense of sadness. We ask our veterans to sacrifice so much, and we all know, who know veterans, it's not just the veterans, it's also veteran families that make that sacrifice, that share in that service, that share in that commitment. And these veterans, some of the more talented, dedicated leaders I know, they're not doing it for the money. They're doing it because they're called to serve. You know how many people jumped into service after 9/11? Friends of mine rushed to join the military, to serve in Iraq and Afghanistan. And now they're home, many of them with invisible wounds, many of them with visible wounds. And the services they rely on for their health care, the services they rely on as lifelines, the services they rely on often that give them hope and opportunity, not compounding their trauma. This is now being attacked by a president who's not keeping his promises. He says he values veterans, but the facts are different. She devoted her life to serving the U.S., then DOJ targeted her. It has been 6 days since Joy Marver was locked out of her office at the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs 5 days since she checked herself into hospital for emergency psychiatric care, and 2 days since she sent a letter to her supervisors, "Please, I'm confused. Can you help me understand?" Now, she followed her wife into the storage room of their house outside of Minneapolis, searching for answers no one could give her. A half dozen bins held the remnants of 22 years spent in service to the U.S. government, first as a sergeant first class in Iraq, then as a disabled veteran, and finally as a VA support specialist in logistics. She devoted her career to a system that had always made sense to her, but now nobody seemed to know whether she had officially been laid off, or for how long, or even why. "Are you sure you never got an email?" asked her wife, Mickey Jo Carlson, 49. "How would I know?" asked Maver, 45. "They deleted my account." "Maybe it's because you were still probationary." "My boss said I was exempt," Marver said. "I was supposed to be essential." In the last few months, more than 30,000 people across the country were fired by President Trump's new initiative called the Department of Government Efficiency, a historic reduction of the federal workforce that has been all the more disruptive because of its chaotic execution. Entire agency divisions have been cut without explanation or mistakenly fired and then rapidly rehired, resulting in several lawsuits and mass confusion among civil workers. After a court ruled last week that many of the firings were illegal, the government began reinstating workers even as the Trump administration appealed the decision and promised more layoffs. The VA alone said it planned to cut about 80,000 more jobs this year, including tens of thousands of veterans. And for Marver, the shock of losing her job was eclipsed by the disorientation of being repeatedly dismissed and belittled by the government she served. She had watched on TV as Trump's billionaire advisor, Elon Musk, took to the stage at a political conference wielding a chainsaw to the beat of rock music, slicing apart the air with what he called his chainsaw for bureaucracy. She had listened to Trump's aides and allies deride federal employees for being lazy, parasitic, unaccountable, and essentially wasting taxpayer money in their quote-unquote fake jobs. In Marver's case, that job had meant helping to retrain soldiers for civilian work and coordinating veteran burials while earning a salary of $53,000 a year. "Here's the note I got a little while after I was hired," Marver told Carlson, pulling a form letter from the government. "You represent the best of who we are as Americans," it read. "You could have chosen to do anything with your talents, but you chose public service. Kind of boilerplate, but it's nice," Carlson said.
Madam Chair. Senator Booker, will you yield for a question?
Before I yield, I just want to acknowledge my friend in the chair, and she's cracking a tight whip, so I appreciate you following the rules here. I got to read this now, and then I'm eager to get your question because you are one of the few people I knew before I got to the Senate.
That is what I wanted to talk about.
Well, I'm sorry. I didn't yield. But I didn't yield for a question.
I'm sorry.
You can't say anything, sir.
Oh.
The parliamentarian will jump all over you. I have the floor. So much power, it's going to my head.
Senator, will you yield for a question?
Oh, man. Known you for like 25 years. I wanted to talk about you, but you're being so insistent. I'll reward your insistence and say I yield for a question while retaining the floor.
And let me ask you, Senator Booker, I can't ask you now, through the chair, let me ask you directly, how long a question you would like. Would you have? I'm happy to provide you with a 5-minute question or a 5-hour question. It depends entirely on.
I actually believe that you would go a 5-hour question to try to help me power through. Senator,
as you know,
we've been at this for.
My wife Susan would.
I love your wife Susan. I love you and your wife Susan, but I love your children more. Your girls are
that's why I came down here. You know, when I remember
Is this a question? Because I yield for a question while retaining the floor.
This is a question, please.
Okay, let's make it a 7-minute question.
This is a question. And I would say to the Senator from New Jersey and to the presiding officer, thank you very much for being here and for enduring this. When I started here, I was sitting in the chair all the way to the right of where you are today, Senator Booker. And I can remember the day you walked in to be sworn in, you came through those doors right there, and I had a huge smile on my face because I knew when you were walking through those doors, when you were walking into this chamber, you would bring with you the kids that you used to work for in Newark, New Jersey. And the reason I knew that was that when you were working for the kids in Newark, New Jersey, as the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, I was working for the kids in Denver as the superintendent of the Denver Public Schools. And at that time, in our country's history, we were engaged in a pretty profound effort to try to make better the schools in our respective communities. Not that everything was perfect, but we were trying to drive achievement for the kids in Newark and the kids in Denver, and we talked about it over many years. And here you walked into this chamber, a place where it would be easy to imagine has long had the habit of treating America's kids like they're someone else's kids, not like they're America's kids. I know that because if the kids in America were represented by the 100 desks that are in this Senate, roughly 9 of them would be graduating with a college degree in our country. 9 of these desks. If we thought about the rates of literacy, the failure in our country to be able to teach people how to read or do mathematics, decade after decade after decade, the proficient students would consume just a few desks in this place, and everybody else would not be able to do basic levels of reading and basic levels of math. And but here you were, somebody who understands that, and here you are, somebody who understands that. And one of the very first projects you and I worked on, and this is coming to my question, was the child tax credit. This was an effort to turn back 30 or 40 years of trickle-down economics that said that what we're going to do is cut taxes for the richest people in the country and just have it trickle down to everybody else. Some people don't know what that means, and if I could, let me just say what that actually means. For you to understand what that tax policy is, that tax policy that Donald Trump has pursued now twice, once when he was president before, and now again, you have to imagine that there is a mayor in Newark, or there is a mayor in Denver, or a mayor in San Diego, or in Miami, who is saying to the people that live in his community, I have an idea. I'm going to go out and borrow more money than we have ever borrowed before as a community. I'm going to go out and borrow a ton of money. And your constituent, my constituents would say, wait a minute, Mayor, wait a minute, that makes me nervous. What are you borrowing all that money for? Because I'm worried about the fiscal condition of my city and my town. This conversation would happen in every city and every town in Colorado or New Jersey, whether they're Democratic or Republican mayors. You'd have to answer the question, what are you spending the money on? What are you going to borrow all this money for? Is it for our parks? No. Is it for our schools? No. Is it to give mental health services to kids who desperately need it? No. Is it for our roads and bridges, our infrastructure? No. Are you going to do something important for our water systems? No. What is the answer? What are you going to do with that money that you are borrowing, that you are mortgaging our kids' future? What is this important thing that you're going to do with it? The answer is we're going to give it to the 2 richest neighborhoods in New Jersey or Newark or Denver, and we're going to expect that it's going to trickle down to everybody else. That is the theory. That is what trickle-down economics is. That is what the Trump tax plan is, and there's a reason why no mayor in America has ever done it, because you would be run out on a rail. Because you couldn't explain it. You're going to borrow money from the kids of our police officers, our firefighters, our teachers, in order to cut taxes for the richest people in the community in the hope that they'll buy a little bit of an extra, I don't know, luxury, and that's going to somehow generate economic activity for everybody else. It is demonstrably true that that has never worked. And by the way, these tax cuts, I say the presiding officer and everybody else within the sound of my voice, have literally never, ever come close to paying for themselves. That is a complete lie. That's why the Congressional Budget Office says this is going to blow a $4.6 trillion hole in our deficit. And for what? To give tax cuts to the richest people in America when they need them least? And when the income inequality is as great as it has been in our country since the 1920s, which brings me to my question. My cherished colleague from New Jersey, what was it we were trying to do with the child tax credit? There were a lot of people who believed that we couldn't even get it passed, that we couldn't even get the IRS to administer it. And then we did get it passed during part of the Biden administration, and lo and behold, more than 90% of the families in New Jersey got a tax cut. Lo and behold, more than 90% of the families in Colorado got a tax cut, not waiting for a trickle down from the wealthiest people, but they got a tax cut directly that did what? Cut in half the childhood poverty rate in America. In the richest country in the world, for one moment, we said, we don't have to accept this level of childhood poverty as a permanent feature of our democracy or a permanent feature of our economy. We can do something different than that. And Senator Booker, that is what you said when you were mayor of Newark. We don't have to accept these generational outcomes of poverty or of poor schools or of lead in the water. We can do something different, and that's what you've brought to the United States Senate as well. The tragedy from my perspective is there are many tragedies about the election of Donald Trump, and by the way, I'll say again on this floor, I don't blame him for getting elected president. You know, he ran and he won. Those of us that were trying to offer a different vision have something to explain about why we were not successful. But one thing I am certain of is that the kids in Newark and the kids in Denver are completely invisible to our current president. That he is not concerned with their welfare or even loses a minute's sleep over the next generation. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, this isn't a numbers and cents question, because I know even though you don't look tired, I'm sure you must be tired after all these hours and hours and hours, but can you talk a little bit, Senator, about how a society should be judged with respect to how we treat the next generation of Americans, how a tax bill should be judged by how we treat the next generation of Americans, how almost nothing else matters except what we do with respect to the next generation of Americans. I can tell you that my daughters, Caroline, Helena, and Ann, understand better than most your commitment to them and to your commitment to their generation, because you've been such an inspiration to them, not just today, but thank you for what you're doing, but for basically their entire lifetimes.
Well, thank you for the question. My long time friend, one of the folks I've known the longest, who I get to serve with, and what you did for me when I came here is you and Sherrod Brown, who sat right there by the door, you let Bennett and Brown become Bennett Brown Booker, 3 Bs, and joined together with some of the most extraordinary House members, and Brother Warnock, and fight for the child tax credit. And it took years, but we found our opening when we called Ron Klain together before the election was even settled and said, please, this is the best thing our country can do is to expand the child tax credit and make it fully refundable. Because we knew, as you said, it would give the overwhelming majority, between 80 and 93%, depending on what state you are, of the people in those states, we expanded the earned income tax credit, it would give them all a tax break. It was, inarguably, one of the greatest tax cuts in the last 50 years. And it cut child poverty in America nearly in half. And child poverty is a moral obscenity. Child poverty is violence against children. Violence. And here's the thing that you and I both know from the research. Every dollar you spend in raising a child above the poverty line, you return to society between $5 and $7 in economic growth and activity, or in lesser costs, because kids above the child poverty line have, for example, less visits to the emergency room. I just don't understand how we are a nation, again, the wealthiest nation that has one of the highest child poverty rates. It makes no sense, 0 sense. When we proved once and for all with that one-year effort, because we couldn't make it permanent, we were short one vote in this body, we proved forever in America that child poverty is a policy choice, not an inevitable reality. And so you ask the great question, why in a nation that was founded on men that studied virtue, the ideals of virtue, they were imperfect geniuses, but they really struggle with moral philosophy. We have the power, we've proven it, to cut child poverty in half. What's the argument against it? Wasteful spending? Come on, come on. Giving trillions of dollars of tax cuts to the wealthiest in America, I'm sorry, it's wasteful spending, especially if it ends up blowing a hole. Those tax cuts don't pay for themselves. Trump won tax cuts, didn't. Renewing them won't. Doing the same thing over and over again and thinking you're going to get different results is the very definition of insanity. You are one of the most passionate. I remember a stem winder of a speech you gave in this body. You were so angry. I love it when it's Bennett Unchained. You were so angry when you started talking about the horrible policies of this nation that has eaten away the inheritance of children to come. Why you went off on the trillions of dollars spent on stupid foreign wars, where our brave men and women fought for this country, but this country made bad mistakes in these long wars. You talked about the money we spent there, and you talked about the first time in American history, common sacrifice every war before that, not just the men and women who were brave enough to go out and fight. You said the first time in American history that we said the only people that are going to bear a burden are the people that are going to go. The rest of you get tax cuts. George Bush, first time ever, we went to war and we gave tax cuts from the Civil War to the Revolutionary War to World War I to World War II. It was a common collective effort. My grandmother talked with pride about victory gardens and pride about war bonds. Everybody pitched in. And so here we are at another crossroads. And is America going to tolerate? Is America going to tolerate this idea that we're going to give extraordinary tax cuts to the overwhelmingly, disproportionately will accrue to the wealthiest amongst us? For what? If I was a mayor, I'd have to answer it. So I appreciate your question, but I also appreciate your moral indignation. I really do. I keep saying over and over again, elevating the voices of Americans on this floor, elevating the point, I hope, that we can't keep doing things like this as business as usual. These are real issues, not of right or left or right or wrong. This is a moral moment in America. And you point out a very clear choice we have when we talk about our tax policy. It should reflect our values. Thank you, sir.
Will the senator yield for a question?
For Jack Reed, I would do just about anything. So I yield for a question while retaining the floor.
First, thank you for continuing to highlight the harm that's being done by the Trump administration on average Americans, working Americans. Flouting the law, withholding federal funds, illegally shutting federal agencies, ruining long-standing alliances, increasing prices, taxes on American consumers. It goes on and on and on. Last week, the Department of Health and Human Services announced that it would fire 20,000 employees. Those cuts appear to be taking shape right now. Is the senator aware that there are reports that thousands of HHS staff have been locked out of their offices this morning?
To answer the senator's question, I've been on the floor since last night. I haven't read any news reports, but when you say that, am I aware of thousands and thousands of HHS employees who've been laid off of their jobs? I'm not aware of it. I'm not surprised. The question isn't, is Donald Trump going to lay more people off? The question isn't, is Donald Trump going to lay more disproportionately veterans off? The question is what are we going to do to stop it when it isn't thoughtful, reasonable cuts, when he talks about the people he's cutting as leeches, demeans and degrades their commitment to service and their noble obligations. We were told that HH&S would be about making America healthy again. And I haven't seen that. I've seen them cut services to give access to children to fresh and healthy foods. I've seen them cut regulations on polluters that make our air quality worse, which hurts people with emphysema, with asthma, with other respiratory diseases. In fact, a lot of the actuarials show more Americans die when polluters are allowed to go back to polluting more. I could go through the things they're doing that are not making our water healthier and safer, not making our air healthier, safer, not making more access to health care that stops and treats chronic disease, not giving access to healthy foods. We're not making America healthy. And so these cuts, they don't surprise me, but they hurt me. They hurt me. These are Americans. These are disproportionately veterans. And I thank you for speaking up for them today.
If the senator would yield for another question.
I yield for a question while retaining the floor.
President Trump and the Secretary of HHS, Secretary Kennedy, are, as I indicated and made you aware, they are firing a host of people today. But the critical staff functions will be undercut. For example, the Low-Income Energy Assistance Program. And the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, they will focus on worker safety. LIHEAP, as you know, provides essential support to literally keep people warm in the winter and cool in the summer in our southern states. And with LIHEAP undercut like that, there will be effects. People will become unhealthy, in fact, possibly couldn't even pass away and perish. NIOSH, on the other, is an agency that looks after 164 million people in this country so they're safe. And we all know, we all remember back all those stories about the Gilded Age, which sometimes I think the administration wants to bring back, where children labored in shops, where garment workers were killed in fires because there was no way to get out. All the exits were sealed. National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health prevents that. And work-related industries, injuries and illnesses cost our economy about $250 billion annually. So that will double, triple, quadruple. And we're seeing all sorts of reports about the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control at CDC. They do critical work. They're under the gun. We're seeing reports that the director of the FDA Center for Tobacco Products has been fired. We can see that President Trump and Secretary Kennedy would rather stand up for big tobacco than for young kids who get hooked on it and it ruins their health. These are just a few of the cuts. And I want you to, I know you're aware of these, I know you're focused on these. They're going to destroy years of progress. And basically, it's being shouldered by working Americans. You know, nobody who lives in Mar-a-Lago needs LIHEAP heating. Nobody who dines at Mar-a-Lago needs occupational health support, but the waiters do, and the grounds people do. So, Senator, just your comments and thoughts.
I so appreciate the question from my friend. I really think empathy is a superpower, and you are Superman in that category. Because you're thinking about the people affected. We throw these acronyms down here, and they sound like government programs, but you meet with the people. I remember when I was starting out my political career in service in Newark, and I had this dear friend named Kim, and she was one of these people that worked trying to sign people up for LIHEAP. And the stories that would affect her of people that was a lifeline for them to have a little bit of resources to help them get their energy costs in a place where they could afford heat in the winter and some air in the summer. Stories of elders and vulnerable. I don't understand how we can be a nation with so much wealth and abundance and we haven't figured out a way to design a system where when you invest in the well-being of people, people thrive. Kids growing up in quality housing with great public schools, with clean air, without lead in their water, above the poverty line. You know what I love about young people in this country is their resiliency. I meet these beautiful children with light in their eyes, and all they need is a little fertile ground, and they go beyond our imagination in what they can achieve. And so here we are taking our national treasure, the resources being paid into our taxes are our national treasure, and what do we invest in, and what do we do with it? Well, we're running up more debt. We're not going to pay for these tax cuts that are overwhelmingly going to go to the wealthiest. But we're taking all these things that people rely on, from our veterans to our seniors to our disabled to expectant moms. We're just taking as much as we can to defer as much of this gross tax cuts that go disproportionately to the wealthy. And so again, I return to where I've been for closing in on 19 hours. I go back to, what are we going to do about it? It can't be business as usual. There are too many things we've already covered that show that this is a moral moment in America. Where do we stand? It's time, as John Lewis, as I keep repeating, he says it's time to get into good trouble, necessary trouble, to redeem the soul of our nation. And when you're talking about, goes directly to the soul, what do we stand for? Who do we stand for? We should stand for each other. Thank you, sir.
Will the senator from New Jersey yield for a question?
To my dear friend, I yield for a question while retaining the floor, and I thank you for being here. I thank you for your leadership. I thank you for what you stand for, and I look forward to your question.
Well, I so appreciate the senator from New Jersey trying to articulate the urgency of this moment. And I think that I know you've discussed many things in the last, I don't know how many hours it is, but it's been many, many hours. And, you know, we just had a hearing this morning related to the markup of the Social Security nominee. And we're just trying to find out because a whistleblower said that he was involved in helping Doge. And we're here today trying to bring attention to the American public that people are trying to rearrange essential services, contractual obligations, things like Social Security or Medicaid or even Medicare, by basically saying, well, we have this efficiency strategy, when in reality, they're over there with numbers just trying to carve something out of the budget, billions of dollars out of Social Security efficiency, or billions and billions and billions of dollars out of Medicaid, which would really come right out of our hospitals who are saying they don't even think they could stay open. But this notion of Social Security, I don't know if you've heard that not only are they closing offices and cutting jobs, they're asking people to re-register So my constituent, who they basically said was dead, was not dead. He wanted his Social Security. So not only did they not give him his check in January, they tried to claw back checks from the previous months out of his bank account. And even though this has got national press and attention, you would think that everybody on the other side would be like, no, that's not what we're trying to do. Even though the president in the State of the Union said all these people were getting Social Security checks, when my constituent is standing in line with less and less staff trying to get his Social Security, and guess what? They're still at it. As of last Friday, they were still at not giving him his Social Security. So what are we unleashing on America? What are we unleashing that even, and I don't know whether you address these Social Security issues in your statements. I so appreciate you emphasizing the urgency here, because this is the dismantling of contractual agreements between the American people and the people's body that we're here to represent them and stand up for it, and people are acting like they don't care. So you are here in an extraordinary athletic achievement. Thank you. Makes your Stanford days look like nothing, right? You've achieved this great long effort to bring illumination to the American people that they're getting screwed over the fact that these cuts are not some efficient way to deliver better service, but in Social Security, they're undermining Social Security. So have you heard of these cases, the whistleblower issue and others, and do you believe that that's what we should be paying attention to, that before we get a vote on Mr. Bisignano, that we should be finding out what whistleblowers are saying and his involvement related to DOJ and making sure that Social Security checks are protected?
I thank you for the question, my friend and my chairwoman. I did talk about this, but it is so worth repeating. At some point in the night, we covered Social Security, and we read story after story after story of senior citizens that are frightened and afraid that the President of the United States would stand in a joint address and attack Social Security, make fun of it with lie after lie after lie about millions and millions of people getting fraudulent checks, when the people who do the fact-checking and even the Social Security folks themselves say that it's a minuscule amount of people getting checks, and usually it's an overpayment. But that didn't stop there. Elon Musk called it a Ponzi scheme. The richest man in the world and the most powerful man in the world, himself a billionaire, are attacking the program that millions and millions of our senior citizens rely on. I read letters of people that say, don't forget about the people who are disabled who rely on SSI, begging us to remember and speak their names and tell their stories. A lot of fear, a lot of terror, a lot of insecurity. But we spoke about this on the floor, that their benefits are already being cut. What do I mean by that? Well, if you are cutting Social Security offices, as one of our colleagues said from New Hampshire, in a rural area, forcing people to have to drive 100 miles if they have a problem, they can't talk on the phone, where the waits on the phones. I read an article from the Wall Street Journal, no left-wing mag, from the Wall Street Journal, talking about how the customer service is going downhill because of the cuts that they're making, and now you're forcing seniors. We read letters from 85-year-olds, 90-year-olds, 93-year-old. They're going to drive 100 miles? I read letters from Social Security workers who now work in inadequate spaces with inadequate staff, unable to do their job that they love. They're not leeches. They're not people that should be demeaned or degraded by the most powerful people in our land. They are public servants who love their jobs and want to serve seniors, but now can't do it because they cut before they thought.
Question, because
I will yield for a question while retaining the floor.
I thank the senator from New Jersey. The issue that I think is not being illuminated enough are the sheer numbers here. In my state of Washington, 1.4 million people on Social Security, 1.8 million people on Medicaid. So you're talking about a big federal relationship. Now, I know that some people in the you know, I actually worked in the private sector. I can tell you one thing about the private sector. The bigger it gets, usually the more inefficient it gets. It just happens. Big organizations can be inefficient. So just because the federal government is the government doesn't mean that Social Security and Medicaid are fraught with fraud. In this case, my constituent's not even getting his check and no one is responding. And you would think with all this commotion that Social Security would want to jump right on it and fix it, but they're not. And the question I have for the Senator of New Jersey is, in my state, I have, as I said, nearly 1.8 million people who are on Medicaid, and the same problem is now where our colleagues are trying to say they're going to get $880 billion out of the energy and commerce budget of the House of Representatives, when in reality, like 90% of that money is Medicare or Medicaid, and if Medicare is supposedly off the table, then the majority of that is going to come from Medicaid. So in my state, I'm hearing from hospitals that that means they could close. That means essential Medicaid services that are used even in our jails or for fentanyl treatment, or Medicaid that is used as a Obamacare expansion for health care, that so many literally red Republican states, Republican governors have said, we want that. The governor of Idaho, yes, we want that. That's an expansion of Medicaid, and it's successfully working at providing health care to millions of Americans. But now our colleagues are entertaining a notion that they could cut this system. They're not really making it clear. So again, the illumination of you showing the urgency is like a big flag that we're trying to show to the American people. This is not a drill. This is now. This is happening. The beginnings of it are happening. And now this debate that's going to ensue is going to be a massive cut into those programs unless the American people wake up. Now, are your states, are you hearing this in New Jersey about the Medicaid cuts, the impacts on hospitals, on the delivery system, on essential services?
I cannot emphasize to you strongly enough, we decided to start this whole thing at 7 p.m. last night with Medicaid. And we read story after story after story after story of people who are Medicaid beneficiaries, who are terrified, who are afraid, who didn't say if they cut $880 billion, if they diminish the cuts in any way to their services, they're holding together their lives in this fragile financial equilibrium that one little tug of a transportation service, one little tug of a home health care giver, it all crumbles. They're terrified and afraid. Some of the Americans are dealing with the greatest challenges, not of their own making. Some of them working full-time jobs and getting an injury. It costs extraordinary amounts of chaos to their lives. So yes, I read from the people who are recipients. I read from the people who run hospitals, from rural hospitals to urban hospitals to level 1 trauma centers, who all said that if they cut hundreds of billions of dollars, that it'll affect them. I did something really important. I read from Republican governors and Democratic governors, because I keep saying over and over, America, this is not right or left, it's right or wrong. It's not a partisan moment. It's an American moment. It's a moral moment. I read voices from Republicans specifically, Republican governors in Medicaid expansion states. They have this trigger. You know this, many states, that if the funding from the federal government ever dips below 90%, boom, Medicare expansion is over. Millions of people in financial crisis, in healthcare crisis. What is it going to take for us to say no? With such a firm voice, such a chorus of conviction, thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans, red, white, and blue, every state saying, do not do this for no good reason but to give the majority of your tax cuts to billionaires like Elon Musk. It makes no sense. Who are we as a country? This is not normal times. This is not usual. We should be standing up, because I read the stories of Republicans who run hospitals, Republicans who are governors, who are all saying, don't do this, don't do this. Senator Padilla, I was teasing, I'm not yielding yet, Senator Padilla, I was teasing that man over there named Bennett that he and I have known each other for years, but you and I have known each other longer. I knew the senator from Washington before I got here, mutual friends. So these are 3 people that were friends of mine before I met this institution. Had Coons here, I have all 4. You, though, I knew longer than Bennett and longer than the great senator from Washington and the chairwoman. We met in 1998, 99, around then. We were both city council people. And the dear friend, the beautiful man who introduced us, told me before we walked in your office that you were a rising star. You were a man of deep decency, that you were going to do extraordinary things in your career, and he did not overstate the fact. You're one of my close friends, and I definitely yield for a question while retaining the floor.
Thank you, and let the record reflect that he said the exact things, same things, probably better things about you, and he was absolutely correct. But I couldn't help but interject right at the moment where I did, because once again, your passion is coming through. There's been, well, first of all, I tremendously admire what you've been doing here on the floor of the Senate today, starting with last night. And as I've been watching off and on, there's these moments where your empathy and your sympathy and your care and concern is coming through. You can't help it. It's who you are. There's been other moments, as you've been talking about some of the key issues and dynamics of this current political climate that we're in, where your passion is coming through, and at times anger. I know it because I've seen it. I know it because we're getting calls in my office about this. I know it because if you monitor comments and commentary on social media about what my colleague is doing here on the Senate floor, some people have asked, why is he so angry? Why, I'd like to say here, right now, that Senator Booker has every right to be angry because of what's going on. I know I'm angry with so much of what's going on, and the American people have every right to be angry with what's going on, because none of what we're seeing come out of the Trump White House is normal. But every day, this approach of flooding the zone with more and more extreme actions runs the risk of making people grow numb to these attacks. And we certainly can't surrender to the feeling of just being overwhelmed by their tactics. And so I want to thank the senior senator from New Jersey for doing what he's doing to shake and awaken the conscience of our country. Now, as I listen to my colleague talk about the real dangers of the Trump administration, what it poses for our nation, I also reflect on what it means for our environment. Because I know it hits home for many folks, but especially in my home state of California. Look, California, many of you have come to visit time and again, is home to some of those beautiful parks and natural wonders in the nation. But if you grew up in Southern California, like I did, you also know there's a flip side to this climate discussion.
Definitely feeling
And we lived through the real costs of climate inaction. Now, growing up, I can tell you not just about the smell of diesel exhaust, which I'll never forget, sitting on a school bus going to and from school, or the regular days where school would be shut down early, we'd all be sent home because of the smog, toxic smog in the air in the greater Southern California area. These were concrete reminders of the real threats that emissions pose to our health. California also knows the dangers posed by extreme weather. We know the droughts, we know the floods, and yes, all too often we've come to know wildfires, devastating wildfires like the ones we experienced in Los Angeles County at the beginning of this year. Now, Senator Booker was kind enough to come visit a few weeks ago to tour Altadena, the epicenter, if you will, of the Eaton fire that devastated so many. And I think we both agree, and anybody who's visited the area to see for themselves would agree, that you cannot see what happened in and around Altadena and come away unmoved. I go on and on with examples and reasons to say to you that this is exactly why California for decades has worked so hard against pollution and against the impacts of climate change. Everything from being aggressive on tailpipe emission standards to our ambitious conservation goals. The 30 and 30 goals set out by the Biden administration were modeled after the 30 by 30 goals set out by the state of California. California is also home to the very first Earth Day, which is now celebrated nationally each and every year. But today, much of our progress is now at risk, because just in the first 2 months of this second Trump administration, we've seen nothing but attacks on this progress of environmental protection. The Trump administration has sought to reverse the endangerment finding, which is the most basic finding of climate science, that yes, greenhouse gases harm public health. They've taken the steps of illegally freezing funding that this Congress had previously appropriated. I'm talking about the types of investments that keep our kids in our communities healthy. Now, earlier this month, the EPA, Trump's EPA, announced that they would be rolling back more than 30 environmental rules. By doing so, they're not just going to make Americans less healthy, they're also going to hurt our economy. And it's going to clear the way for China to become the world leader in green technology. So much for America first, if they continue down that road. But even while the Trump administration has refused to fight climate change, it's one thing to not be helpful. They've actually taken a number of steps that are actually harmful and hurtful. Make it harder, for example, for states to respond to natural disasters. They've toyed with tying wildfire disaster assistance to political demands. They've proposed eliminating FEMA. They've implemented federal freezes on things like hazardous fuel removal and the hiring of federal firefighters, things that we need to do in the winter months to prepare for the hot and dry summer months when the risk is greatest. They've even brazenly opened up dams and flooded portions of the Central Valley to pretend President Trump was helping with the Los Angeles wildfires, when the fact is those fires were contained when they released this water that's no longer available in the hot, dry summer months. So they're not just refusing to act or to help, they're making matters worse for states like California and many others. So that's what this fight is about. Our fight for the environment is about America's health and safety. It's about American jobs, and it's about America's future. With all that being said, my question to Senator Booker is this: for the next generation of Americans, for the young people who are tuning in and wondering, well, what is it that I can do? Do I have a voice? Do I have any power? What would you say to them? How can they take action?
I love you for that question, my friend. And I just want to talk about anger, because I've been all over the place. I read these letters and they make me sad. I read these letters, they make me angry. I read these letters, they make me embarrassed that we're a country where people have to rend their pride and beg for help because of the little teeny modicum of support they get from a service like Medicaid. But I've been saying over and over again, as I've tried to learn from my elders, if I've tried to learn from the heroes I revere, that I learned from my parents, and anger is not a bad emotion. It's what you do with that emotion that's important. Does it consume you? Does it drive you to hate other people, or do you allow it to fuel you? Because it was ferocious love that had ancestors of all of ours in this country make it through the insults, no Irish need apply, the injuries of Japanese internments. It's what do you do with those feelings? You're not defined by what happens to you, you're defined by how you choose to respond. So I tell people, anger, if you're not angry, let that fuel you. Well, what about the heartbreak that I feel? Well, I get emotional sometimes because I read a letter and something in it makes me remember somebody I know, or to feel the hurt of constituents begging for help, and it breaks my heart. But I tell you, if America hasn't broken your heart, you don't love her enough. Because there's so much heartbreak. And if America hasn't broken your heart, you don't love her enough. Because there's so much heartbreak and fear and pain in a nation where people are seeing their economic hopes and dreams of maybe buying a home or having the money to help their kids with school or to meet their basic needs, where so many Americans are one flat tire, one $400 hit to their account, and they're suddenly doing payday loans or having to struggle to find a way through. There's so much heartbreak in this country. Great love means you make yourself vulnerable to having that heartbreak. But the heart's this powerful tool that even when it's broken, it still beats. And what about people that are afraid? I get afraid sometimes. I think about this legislation, if it goes through, what's going to happen in my state? I know the hospitals. I know the recipients. But you're telling me, look at our history. Is there anybody in American history that you revere that didn't face extraordinarily fear? Because you cannot have great courage without great fear. Fear is a necessary precondition to courage. And so you ask me, my friend, what can people do? I want to remind people, as I've said before on this floor, to remember the truth that I heard before I came here, that change does not come from Washington, it comes to Washington by the people who demand it. I said this earlier. Do you think that we got suffrage in this country because a bunch of men on this Senate floor right here put their hands in and said, hey, fellas, on the count of three, women get the right to vote. Ready? 1, 2, 3, go. No, that's not how it happened. It happened because of Alice Paul. She was a young person from New Jersey. She broke with the course of human events. Alice Paul, one of my greatest heroes, you know what she did? She caused a heck of a lot of good trouble. Necessary trouble. She is the first American ever, young American in her early 20s, the first American ever to protest in front of the White House. She broke with the older, more mature suffrage organizations and went to the White House and did what she called a silent retreat, protest. She held up signs quoting President Woodrow Wilson's own words about freedom and equality and say, aren't they true for me? Like a great black woman would later say, ain't I a woman? Don't I deserve rights? You don't think she was afraid? Let me tell you how afraid she was. Hundreds came out to jeer her, blocking the street, and then they arrested her for obstructing public passage. And then what do you do with a strong, powerful woman? You say that she's crazy, and you throw her in an insane asylum. Before Gandhi, sitting in jail before Gandhi, Alice Paul, this young American from New Jersey, goes on a hunger strike. And they don't honor her hunger strike. They shove tubes down her throat, crack eggs into the tube, force feeding her, and thank God for the First Amendment, which is under attack here in America. The freedom of the press, under attack here in America. Look at the dragging the journalist Jeffrey Goldberg right now for doing what? Getting the highest security officials in the land, just showing them the laws that they were breaking. A journalist covered what Alice Paul did. She gets out of jail. Because of public outrage, she goes back to protesting in front of the White House, and Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, finally comes out and joins her in supporting suffrage. You don't think she was afraid, angry, heartbroken, but she did something different. She chose a new and unusual pathway to show that this is not the America I believe in. The poetry of Langston Hughes. America never was America to me, but I swear this oath, America will be. The poetry of Langston Hughes. There's a dream in this land with its back against the wall. To save a dream for one, we must save the dream for all. It's what you do with those emotions that matters. Does it call you to greater service? Does it call you to greater sacrifice? Does it call you to greater love? And let me say one more thing. As we were speaking, I just wanted to bring this up. You know I love history. And this is one of my favorite letters, Alex, my colleague, Senator Padilla. It's one of my favorite letters in all of American history, because an obscure, unknown American, obscure and unknown, would never have been known, writes a letter to a powerful, powerful man. This obscure American woman that nobody know or would have heard of, ever, if somebody didn't hear about her story and write a book. She would be gone, like most of the great heroes in American history, that we don't know their names. It reminded me of the last healthcare debate when Donald Trump tried to take away the ACA, and how many amazing, heroic people who I don't remember their names, but rose up and say, no, 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 that got 3 of my colleagues, McCain, Murkowski, and Collins, to change their vote on this floor and stop healthcare being stripped away from 20 million Americans. Well, here is what I mean. It's not the powerful people with titles and celebrity and offices and billions of dollars that have ever shaped this country. What shapes this nation is hard-working, determined Americans who say, I'm going to redeem the dream of America. I'm going to heal the soul of this country. I'm going to demand that we do better, that we rise higher, that we make change happen. What can you do? That you ask if you're a young person? I love this letter. It's written by Frederick Douglass to an unknown person that would have never been heard of if it wasn't for this book. And he writes to his friend, I'm glad to know that the story of your eventful life has been written by a kind lady, and the same is soon to be published. You ask for what you do not need from me, Frederick Douglass writes. You call upon me for a word of commendation. I need such words from you far more than you could need them from me. He says to this unknown woman, especially where your superior labors and devotion to the cause of the lately enslaved of our land are known as I at least know them. The difference between us is very marked, says the great Frederick Douglass, one of the most known people. He was the most photographed man, period, in the 1800s. The difference between us is very marked, Frederick Douglass says. Most that I have done and suffered in the service of our cause has been in public, and I have received much encouragement at every step of the way. You, on the other hand, he says to this woman, you, on the other hand, have labored in private. I have wrought in the day, you in the night. I have had the applause of the crowd and the satisfaction that comes of being approved by the multitude, while the most you have done has been witnessed by a few trembling, scared, and footsore bondsmen and women whom you have led out of the house of bondage, and whose heartfelt God bless you has been your only reward. The midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witnesses of your devotion to freedom and to heroism, accepting of John Brown of much encouragement Accepting of John Brown of sacred memory, I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people that you have. Much of what you have done would seem improbable to those who do not know you as I know you. It is to me a great pleasure and a great privilege to bear testimony for your character and your works, and to say to those to whom may come that I regard you in every way truthful and trustworthy. He gave his legitimacy to this book project, Frederick Douglass, to then an unknown woman who did the most heroic things. Her name was Harriet Tubman. How did we get here, America, to this privileged place? Well, we got here because of that incredible infrastructure project that this place didn't fund called the Underground Railroad, where black Americans and white Americans broke laws, did civil disobedience to stop slavery. How did we get here? We got here because young 20-somethings got upon a bridge named for a grand wizard of the KKK, named the Edmund Pettus Bridge. We got here because they marched. We got here because they were beaten. We got here because they bled, and I may know one or two of the people on that bridge. I may know one of the two of their names, but I am in this body because of them. How did we get here, America? We got here because of people whose names I don't know, who fought at Seneca Falls. How did we get here? Because of people whose names I don't know, who stood at Stonewall. We got here because of people's names I don't know, who were there at Selma. This is the answer to your question. This is an American moral moment. This is the question of where do we stand for health care? Where do we stand for Social Security? Where do we stand for VA benefits? Where do we stand for our American neighbor when the call and commandment of every faith in our land is to love your neighbor? What is the quality of our love, America? Now is the time to get angry, but let that anger fuel you. Now is your time to get scared for what's happening to your neighbors and let that fear bring about your courage. Now is your time to stare at despair and say, you will not have the last word, because I'm going to stand up and at least I can give one person hope in this country. Can I give one person hope in this country? And so what do I want from my fellow Americans? Do better than me. Do better than we in this body. We are flawed and failed people. I see people showing up at our town halls yelling at us, Democrat and Republican, do more. How are you letting this happen? Well, I hate to tell you, we're doing all that I can think of. This is why I'm standing here, to try to give voice to those people. But what is more needed from now is less people sitting on the sidelines, less people being witnesses of American history, and more people determined to make it, to make history, to call to the conscience of this nation, to say, I will not stand for another American to lose their health care for a billionaire. I will not stand for another veteran who's dedicated to stopping the suicide of other veterans to lose their job. I won't stand for the air quality in my community to be made worse because they're letting polluters pollute more. I won't stand for the collective assaults on the Constitution by a man who even the highest judge in our land, a Republican-appointed judge, said, stop threatening and bullying other branches of government. When is it going to be enough? My voice is inadequate. My efforts today are inadequate to stop what they're trying to do. But we, the people, are powerful. We are strong. We have changed history. We have bent the arc of the moral universe. And now is that moral moment again. It's the moral moment again. God bless America. We need you now. God bless America. If you love her, if you love your neighbor, if you love this country, show your love. Stop them from doing what they're trying to do. For almost 20 hours, we have laid out what they're trying to do. 20 hours. I want to stand more, and I will, but I'm begging people, don't let this be another normal day in America. Please, God, don't let them take Medicaid away from 10, 20, 30, or 40 million Americans who desperately need it. Don't let them do it. I will yield to my dear friend who I owe an apology. At the last hours of your birthday, as I was preparing for this, I realized that we have a special bond. Before I yield, I want to tell this guy.
The senator was discussing.
Hold on. I yield, but I retain the right to the floor. So I yield, but I retain the right to the floor.
I want to ask some questions about veterans in this country, but before I do so, you talked a lot about courage.
Yes, sir.
And how the world has been changed by people of courage. And I look down at my tie that I have on today,
Yes.
which has the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And we think of that as a sacred document, an important document in our history, but these people had the courage to put their lives on the line for a radical idea that people could govern themselves and that we could be independent of a monarch. And they were putting their lives on the line. That's courage. And I'm afraid we have people around here, Senator, who won't put their jobs on the line for the idea of America, for our Constitution, for the guarantees that are provided in the Constitution, for the First Amendment, for the structure of the Constitution, for the independence and separation of powers, which is what provides the protection, the essential protection for our freedoms. But let me ask a question about veterans. We had a hearing this morning in the Veterans Affairs Committee. We were hearing nominees. And I commented that here we are mostly voting on nominees in this extraordinary, historic time as if everything is normal. What I said in the committee this morning was, we're playing Nearer My God to Thee on the deck of the Titanic. And we're talking about all these nominees and all these votes that we're having and not talking about what's happening to our country. And in terms of veterans, here's what's happening. Number one, every time the guy with the chainsaw takes so much pleasure in firing people, if you hear about 1,000 people fired in this government, chances are over 300 of them are veterans. 30% of the federal workforce are veterans. In the VA, I suspect it's even a higher number. So what's happening in the Veterans Administration? The first thing that happened was a hiring freeze. And the hiring freeze affected everybody in the Veterans Administration until somebody said, well, wait a minute, what about doctors and nurses? What about direct care workers? And they said, oh, wait a minute, we didn't mean for that. And that's sort of symbolic of the way this thing is going, because they're not thinking. It's ready, fire, aim, time after time. And so you have a hiring freeze. Then they say, oh, well, wait a minute, there's this group we want to do. But then they leave the hiring freeze in place for the people that are working behind the scenes. I think the senator will agree that if nobody's there to answer the phone when a veteran calls to make a claim or make an appointment, that's a denial of benefits, just as if they've cut the benefits. Okay, so 2,400 people fired. And by the way, those people being fired are getting emails that say you're being fired for poor performance. There was no analysis of performance. There was no examination of how they were actually doing or what these people were contributing. It was random. It was people who were on probation. You know why? Because they're easier to fire under our laws. So we've got people being fired ostensibly for poor performance. Think of that as somebody who's put their life on the line for their country because they're a veteran, and then they go to work in public service for the Veterans Administration, and they're being told poor performance, when everybody knows that's a shame. So the next thing that happens is the Veterans Administration announces they're going to fire 83,000 people over the next 6 months. Now, they say, we're going to return to the size of the Veterans Administration it was in 2019. Number one, that's an arbitrary number. Why not 2020 or 2016? It's an arbitrary number. It's not based on any analysis or deep thought. Here's the problem, Senator, and I want you to be ready to respond to this. Here's the problem. There have been 7 major pieces of legislation benefiting veterans since 2019, the biggest of which, of course, is the PACT Act, the largest expansion of veterans benefit program in probably the last 30 or 40 years, and you need people to administer that program. And instead, they're firing people. And the Secretary of the Veterans Administration says, don't worry, it's not going to affect services at all. I don't think that statement passes the straight-face test. And then we have a statement from the VA that says, we've canceled 600 contracts, but they won't tell us what they are. I'm on the Veterans Affairs Committee. We don't know what they are. We don't know what the plan is for those 83,000 people that are going to be fired. And I guess my question is, what do you think of an organization that says to a veteran, thank you for your service, you're fired?
Well, as we were talking earlier, the firings are adding up. It's going to be now about 80,000 people from the VA alone. A disproportionate number of them are veterans. And so that is a rollback in service. We already know that veterans in all of the government agencies represent about 24% of the government workers we're talking about that are getting fired. And these are veterans, as I read their stories, that just want to keep serving their country, from the national parks to serving their fellow veterans and helping them get health care. And we are seeing people that get exemplary reviews, and then they're fired as probational workers under the only way they can, according to the law, is to say that they're a bad federal worker. And then they get insult on top of it when the highest or the most powerful man in the world and the richest man in the world, Trump and Musk, come together and call the guy making $45,000 serving other veterans, they call him a leech, they call him a parasite. And so I hear what you're saying. Like, these are folks that I read their stories. They did things that few Americans would do. They went overseas and served in combat. We had one of our dear friends here who lost her legs in combat, but she stands taller than most all the people in this body. These are the people that are so ingrained in their bodies and minds and souls to serve America, to love America. This president calls somebody like John McCain a sucker. The guy who drafted dodged the draft. And so I hear what you're saying, and one of the things you're just saying is it makes no sense. Nobody came to the Veterans Committee in the Senate who actually approves the resources, establishes the agencies, and should have the say, according to this document, this vaunted, sacred, civically sacred text, our Constitution. And so, what are you to say to them if you don't even know what the plan is? You can't even explain to us what's your plan to making the VA system more efficient. Now, here's the other thing. We passed in this body some of my favorite senators, like John Tester, who I miss so much. Maybe I even just miss bumping into the guy, because he was the only person in the Senate that let me run from one hallway all the way and hit him. I used to joke that it was this test to see what happens when the unstoppable force meets the immovable object. He is a void in this place, but he stood for that PACT Act, gave some of those fiery speeches, and finally we got that bill passed. And we had to add tens of thousands of jobs because of the increased hundreds of thousands of people that were affected from these burn pits or from other challenges. And now we're cutting back 83,000 employees? Patty Murray came down here and said something that affected me in my first weeks as a senator when I, in New Jersey, sat down with women veterans, and they told me how long they had to wait for gynecological care. And so what is this administration doing in its 83,000 cuts? They're going to improve services to our female veterans? I don't believe it. I don't believe it. Show me I'm wrong. Because we have an Article I duty, oversight, checks and balances. Are we doing that right now? One of the worst things I've seen happen in national security, and by the way, there are national security screw-ups on both parties. Nobody has a monopoly on this. Let's not be overly partisan here. But weeks ago, who are supposed to be the pros and set the example, our national security leadership was using a commercial app to communicate classified documents, and they had it on disappearing messages, so they're violating a law of the land called the Preserving Public Records Act. Now, I've heard from Republicans and Democrats, this is outrageous, there should be an investigation. We should be asking common sense questions. Was this a pattern and practice of communication? How many other things that are classified have you been communicating about? There's a lot of really important questions that they should have to answer to. But where are the hearings, folks? I just wonder why this body is shrinking from the articulated duties that we all raised our hands and said we would defend and preserve this Constitution and what it says we should do, what it says our jobs should do. But you're a senator, I'm a senator, I can't tell you what the cut VA plan is. I can't tell you it. They haven't come in here and told us. Are we doing our job? I can't tell you, are we preserving and fighting for national security after one of the biggest national security scandals I've seen since I've been here? They don't have a providence in a partisan way, but they should answer for it. Are we doing our constitutional duty? What about the administration that is ending the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, ending that agency, ending the Department of Education? Do they have the right to do that according to this document? No. Are we saying, hey, we're going to stand up for the people and preserve this document? No. Thank God for the Article 3 branch of government, because they're being dragged into court, and Republican appointed judges and Democratic appointed judges are saying, can't do it. But you know what Trump is doing? He's ignoring the courts, and then he's demonizing the judges. You know that threats on judges in America, the threats have gone up 400%? You know that I had a federal judge, God bless her, where somebody thought they were going to her house, they did, but she wasn't home, and they murdered her son and shot her husband? And Trump is out there threatening judges, dragging them on Twitter or X or whatever he's calling it now? This is America. I know people on both sides of the aisle, we believe in common decency. We believe in respect. We believe that the highest office in the land should represent the best of our values, not the worst, not a guy that we wouldn't even let babysit our kids. And so I don't know what's going on with veterans. But I'm not going to sit by and do nothing. That's why I'm standing here. That's why I read the voices of so many veterans. Let's elevate the voices of the Americans who are being hurt and harmed. Let's talk for them if they can't talk for themselves. Let's tell them that we see you, we love you, and that all of us, we're going to fight for you.